Welcome back, everyone. Today we're diving into a topic that's been around for thousands of years, but is making headlines again in new and exciting ways. Hemp. Whether you know it as the eco-friendly alternative to plastics, a game changer in the wellness industry, or the misunderstood cousin of cannabis, marijuana, hemp is taking the world by storm. But there is a lot more to it than meets the eye. From its ancient roots to modern innovations, hemp had the power to reshape industries, reduce environmental footprints, and revolutionize the way we think about sustainability. Stick around, because in this episode, we'll break down the science, explore the myths, and reveal the potential of hemp to change our future. It's time to separate the facts from fiction and see what's really behind the hype. Let's get started. Okay, Patrick, it's welcome and it's glad to have you here. Hemp products are popular in the United States and sold everywhere, from hemp cereal and oil to hemp clothing. But it says made in Canada on it, or made in Germany. Yeah, explain to us how some things in the United States are legal to sell, but illegal to produce.
Or illegal to buy this is a situation that we find ourselves in, even though hemp was such a part of the founding of our country, with the founding fathers even themselves being hemp farmers. Hemp products are very popular in the United States. Every year they sell more hemp cereal. You can buy it in any supermarket in the United States. Of course, hemp clothing, but as you noted, it says made in Canada, made in Germany, made in Romania, because hemp is...
But is it really made in Romania, or maybe it might be made in the United States, but just written that?
No, because hemp is prohibited to grow in the United States.
Okay.
Now, some of that changed in 2019 with Trump's farm bill, but you don't revive an ancient industry through pilot programs. And the farm bill that allowed for hemp was really just a research program, and the response of the states has been quite interesting, because even some of the most liberal states and liberal counties, they took it upon themselves to ban hemp. So I'm from Humboldt County, and as soon as Trump lifted the federal ban on hemp, Humboldt County went ahead and banned hemp. And there's complicated reasons for this, but I don't think it is really intellectually honest at this point to speak of hemp being legal in the United States.
Undoubtedly, hemp was very much a part of the entire world for many centuries, and very important and influential in the founding of the United States, with even major cities being named for the plant, like Hempstead, Connecticut.
Right.
For people who aren't aware, "stad" is a suffix that means city, so they were calling it Hemp City. I understand that for most of America's history, drugs were legal and addiction was considered a medical issue, not a criminal one, isn't it?
Yeah, that's true. And in fact, there's been good research that shows that when you criminalize addiction, you actually drive up the addiction. But it was a different time in American history, and hemp was widely available, as was its psychoactive cousin.
Okay.
And yes, it was very important for the founding fathers, and I think we're going to talk a little bit about the history.
Yeah, before talking about the history, so what's the difference between hemp and marijuana? Can you clarify the terms?
Yeah, well, of course, marijuana is not a scientific term. Marijuana is Spanish, and it comes from the time when the plant was demonized for political reasons, the cotton industry, the oil industry. The problem is we don't have language to talk about a plant that crosses universes. For example, cotton, it just has one use. It's not a food. So our language to deal with plants represents the simplicity of most plants. The fact that hemp has so many uses, we really struggle with language. The cannabis plant has so many uses. So the hemp and marijuana, they're both from the same plant, Cannabis sativa.
Cannabis sativa.
Yeah, that's the base plant for which we get non-psychoactive cannabis and psychoactive cannabis. So it helps if we refer to non-psychoactive cannabis as hemp and psychoactive cannabis as marijuana, even though marijuana is not a scientific term. What makes a separate definition for hemp is it's 0.3% THC or less. THC stands for tetrahydrocannabinol, which is the psychoactive ingredient in cannabis. So if it's 0.3% THC or less, it's considered hemp. And this definition was actually written into Trump's 2019 Farm Bill. A marijuana farmer is looking to get 10% or more THC if they can.
And what's the perception of hemp in Latin America?
That's very interesting, because if you ask most people, do they know what hemp is? They're not going to know. And believe me, I've done this. The Spanish word for hemp.
You mean in the United States or
in the United States and in Ecuador? So the word in Spanish is Cañamo. Although in Ecuador, over the last few years, they've also started a pilot program for hemp where farmers can get licenses and start with hemp. And you've seen a proliferation of hemp products, hemp soaps, hemp shampoos, different products with hemp. But most people in Ecuador, if you talk to them about hemp, they're not going to know what you mean. And Ecuador is a very traditional society. In a lot of ways, it's like the United States was in the 1950s. But because of the proximity to Colombia and the historical connection with the Colombian drug cartels and their own criminal gangs that traffic in cocaine, there's a confusion between marijuana and cocaine. And so a lot of people, as soon as you start explaining what is hemp, Cañamo, they tune out. They've never heard that it can be used for anything other than smoking. And so it's challenging. Now, that has started to change over the last couple of years with the introduction of hemp products in the Ecuadorian market, but there's still a lot of prejudice, a lot of confusion. And as far as I'm concerned, smoking is the least useful of this. This is the least important use of this plant that has been used. It has over 25,000 uses.
And is the perception of hemp any different in the United States?
Yes. Well, most people in the United States haven't heard of hemp. I know. My brothers, my father, I had to explain to them what hemp was. And that's sad, because even when my grandfather was a boy, hemp was perfectly legal. Holly, a lot of the times when people hear that I'm from California.
Yeah, that's what I was asking you. Like, it's really funny when you said that when people hear you're from California, a lot of time they ask you about cannabis being legal there, and you have to tell them that they've been massively misinformed, don't you?
Yeah, there was the medical marijuana law, and then in 2016, the law which We're told legalized marijuana, but we wouldn't speak of cotton being legal in a country or in a state where the only use was, pardon my crudeness, but to wipe your butt. If we said that the only use that was allowed for toilet was for toilet paper, that was the only use of cotton, and all the other uses of cotton remained illegal, we wouldn't speak of cotton being legal in that state. We might speak of it being legal for some uses.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So the fact that California can continue to prohibit hemp while they're fine with people just burning it up, that really raises questions about whether cannabis is legal. Because remember, when we're talking about hemp or marijuana, it's the same plant, it's cannabis. And I was in California in 2016 when they were passing this law, and actually read the law, and they didn't have to, but they wrote in a new prohibition of hemp. Hemp was already prohibited, but they just wanted to be clear. They reinstituted and permanentized, reinstitutionalizing the prohibition of hemp.
But what are some uses of hemp?
Well, it has over 25,000 uses. Along with bamboo, hemp is among the fastest growing of plants. It needs no chemicals to grow. It's used to make a variety of commercial and industrial products, including rope, textiles, clothing, shoes, food, paper, bioplastics, insulation, like the insulation that people use to keep their houses warm that they put in the walls, currently made from fiberglass. Biofuel, Rudolf Diesel, and he invented the diesel engine. It took his last name. When he invented the diesel engine, he invented it to be ran on hemp. There's also hemp concrete, which is, you get hemp concrete, like for roads and sidewalks, by mixing the wooden refuse with lime. And hempcrete actually sucks in CO2. You mentioned in your beautiful introduction about hemp lowering the carbon footprint.
Exactly.
And it sequesters CO2. And, we're told that CO2 is the culprit behind climate change. And so hemp actually sequesters it. Hemp takes out heavy metals from the fields where it's grown. Look, there was even a hemp automobile.
Would I be
Henry Ford, the founder of Ford Motor Company, even designed a hemp automobile.
So, Patrick, would it be fair to say that for the early times of American history, hemp was available, but marijuana wasn't?
No, it wouldn't be fair to say that, because this was before the drug war, and this was a time when you could go down to the pharmacy and buy cocaine and opium. They just had a totally different approach to these things. And there was hashish oil that was available in the pharmacies. Hashish, of course, being
hashish is an Arabic word.
Yeah, concentrated marijuana oil. So, and that's, again, we struggle with the language, because hemp, non-psychoactive hemp, was used in medicine for so many years in the United States, like gelatin capsules, but also psychoactive cannabis, what we would call marijuana today, was used for pain reliever, as a cure for premenstrual tension, migraines, so many things. And so
in preparing for this podcast, you told me a funny story of a conversation you heard at a dance in California in 2016. So tell us what the man said.
Yeah, I was actually at a dance in Humboldt County with my mother, and I was sitting at the table across from this couple, and he said to her, you know what my father did?
Yeah.
My father sold opium and hashish. I'm like, okay, that immediately got my attention. But then he went on and explained he was a pharmacist in the 1920s.
Okay.
And that illustrates the fact that it was just a different epoch, a different time in American history. In the 1920s, if you were a pharmacist, you sold hashish and you sold opium. You didn't. It wasn't considered the vice that
It
it is
wasn't considered haram.
to today. Yeah, forbidden. And there were less addictions, and addictions were seen as medical issues. But also, like when you prohibit something, it makes the stronger forms of the drugs more available. Because when we had the prohibition of alcohol, there was a time in American history in the 30s, maybe I think the 20s as well, where there was the prohibition of alcohol, and that's when you had bootleggers get really rich. John Kennedy's father got rich selling illegal alcohol, but nobody wanted to sell beer because people could make more money selling whiskey. In the same way, when you prohibit these things, like whether it's opium poppies or cannabis, you drive into the illegal market the strongest forms of these substances, because if alcohol is prohibited, nobody's going to want to buy beer. Everybody's going to be buying whiskey. And you've seen that same thing. Marijuana growers have tried to get the most THC out of the plant, and actually the lesser, more therapeutic versions are forgotten about. And I think it's fair to say that you don't only smoke it if you're like having a migraine or something. You can also take it in capsules or oils.
Exactly. So let's back up a little. Tell us about hemp's history. Bring it from ancient times up until modern American history.
Well, we've known about hemp for thousands of years. It was the first plant, one of the first plants cultivated by man. And we know this from archaeological evidence in Egypt, in China, in India. Very important for survival, for clothing, for fiber. And then bringing up to a more modern time, the colonists, the first colonists in Jamestown in 1619, they were required by King George of England to grow hemp. So the first colonies in the United States were British colonies. And they were required to send back so much hemp over the oceans back to England. It was that important. George Washington wrote about hemp. The hills of Mount Vernon, where he lived, were covered with hemp. Thomas Jefferson, of course, who wrote the Declaration of Independence on hemp paper, he famously said, hemp is of the utmost importance for the protection and I think he said for the protection and well-being of the United States. He didn't say defense, he didn't say money, he said hemp is of the utmost importance for the protection and the longevity of the United States. And hemp was used until about 1880. 80% of the paper in the United States was made from hemp. Now, hemp was very labor intensive. It took a lot of labor to harvest. And that labor was traditionally done by slaves. So after the end of the Civil War and the emancipation of the slaves, hemp became less viable as a crop just because of economics, and it started to grow out of fashion. But even still, you could find hemp products everywhere. The medical books from that time list hemp medicines as uses for hundreds of different ailments. And then I think it's really interesting that the United States almost had a sustainable hemp-based economy, because in the early 1900s, at the end of the 19th century, the United States experienced a technological boom with cars, with steam engines. And in 1917, a German immigrant by the name of George Schlichten developed a hemp decorticator, which was a machine that could process the hemp and do what was traditionally the work of slaves. And as soon as he patented his invention for the hemp decorticator, because the hemp comes out as a cord, so you got to decord it, the economic viability of hemp came right back. But there were industrialists, newspaper magnates that had holdings in forest land, also magnates that were working on synthetic fibers from petroleum products that were threatened by the reemergence of hemp. One of them was William Randall Hearst. He had he has the famous Hearst Castle in California, but he was making money from the newspapers and from cutting down trees. And so he used his newspapers to make a campaign to demonize marijuana. And they did it by demonizing marijuana, but as a way to get hemp illegal. And when I've explained to people in the United States what hemp is and how it's prohibited, one of the things they'll tell me is, well, the government had to prohibit hemp because of its relationship to marijuana. But you look at history, and it's exactly the opposite.
Exactly.
It was
the opposite.
They prohibited marijuana as a way to secretly get rid of hemp. And the newspapers from the time, you can see this kind of demonization that was happening at the time. Headlines like "Mexican crazed by marijuana runs amok with butcher knife." Another newspaper headline from the time: "Mexican family go insane. Five said to be stricken by eating marijuana." "Weed from the devil's garden. Smoking weed turns Mexicans to wild beasts." "The burning weed with its roots in hell." "Weird orgies and wild parties in the dope house. America's newest narcotic menace. Dope created ecstasy, avalanching into frightful perversions. Evil Mexican plant that drives you insane. It's a vicious racket with its arms around your children. One puff started her on her way." And so in 1937, the Congress passed the Marijuana Tax Act, but there was no debate. And the debate in the Senate lasted 2 minutes. There was no conversation amongst the politicians. But the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 essentially made it illegal. It required you to buy a stamp in order to plant cannabis or hemp, and the government didn't give any stamps. Now, there was a brief period during the World War II where they needed to have hemp for their ships, and they even made a film, 1942 film, "Hemp for Victory." But then as soon as the war was over, and they went to having it illegal again.
What were more of the factors and motivations that led to hemp's prohibition?
Well, the cotton industry and the petroleum industry. I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but one of the uses of hemp is as a biodegradable plastic, and there's an island in the Pacific Ocean the size of Texas that's all plastic, but hemp plastic just returns to Mother Nature. So those that were cutting down trees to make paper were threatened by hemp. The cotton industry was threatened by hemp. They wanted to have a monopoly on clothing. And cotton is an environmental disaster to grow. And those that were working on synthetic fibers from petroleum products. I like to imagine that the history of the United States could have been different. And I know it's very controversial to cut down trees, but sometimes the solutions are staring us in the face.
Yeah, tell us about the movie Reefer Madness.
Reefer Madness, yeah. Well, this was actually a movie that these industrialists made in order to demonize marijuana, and that was their campaign that terminated with prohibition of hemp and the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. And it's just this crazy movie. Actually, some of the headlines that I was reading earlier were from that movie. And it was forgotten about, but then it was rediscovered, I think, in the 1980s. And it's become a cult classic. And now it's considered a great work of satire. But it's just this movie where you see people like taking a puff off a marijuana cigarette and then jumping out windows. And it was trying to convince people that smoking pot would make you go insane. And it was, right now, these days, we call that racist, the Mexican connection, and then we call it fake news. But at the time, I mean, this was a full-on demonization campaign. And I mean, watching this movie now, it strikes you as satire, but it was part of this campaign to demonize it. And it's been even made into a musical on Broadway. But we refer actually to this whole period of demonization of cannabis. We refer to it as reefer madness. So the name of the movie is actually used now to talk about this whole period, start of the 20s and 30s, to prejudice American people against the plant. But when they passed the Marijuana Tax Stamp Act, there was no debate in the Senate. They just passed it, and then hemp slipped out of history to the point now where most Americans, if you ask them what is hemp, they wouldn't even be able to tell you.
Yeah, and that brings us to the end of the first part of today's conversation about hemp. Remember, there's a second part, Patrick.
I'm looking forward to it.
When we're going to speak about different aspects and more questions about hemp. So if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to our channel on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, and check out our content on BitChute. That way you'll never miss an episode as we continue to explore thought-provoking topics like this. Yeah, Patrick?
Yeah.
So thank you very much. Thanks for tuning in. And as always, stay curious and stay engaged. See you next time. Bye-bye.